Welcome to the Easter edition of Freedom Friday. A few days ago, I visited the Ulster Museum in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Yes, a few days ago, I was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I saw something I didn't expect to see there. Not only were there artifacts from around the world, but I saw honesty, I saw transparency, I saw labels that didn't just describe the objects as you would expect, but they also told the story about how they got there. Some were taken, stolen from their indigenous creators worldwide, and some were misrepresented. Some carried stories that had been distorted for generations, but now in this European museum, these stories are starting to be told differently. Proverbs 12:17 declares, "An honest witness tells the truth, but a false witness tells lies." The Ulster Museum is transforming itself into an honest witness to the centuries of exploitation that Europe's institutions have inflicted upon the world's indigenous people, robbing them not only of their cultural heritage, but of their place in the human story. The museum describes its world cultures collection as an opportunity to restore the voices of people who had been historically marginalized and misrepresented. And what struck me is this: Ulster Museum is transforming these objects of art into counter-story witnesses to what happens when power takes what it did not create. One of the first pieces I saw was a canoe from the Solomon Islands. Now, the Solomon Islands are a group of islands in the South Pacific, as many of us would know. Its people have long maintained rich spiritual, artistic, and ecological knowledge shaped by their close relationship with the ocean and land. The canoe, as you see here, is beautifully constructed, decorated with shells, carved with precision. But the museum label didn't stop at admiration. They acknowledged that it was taken in the late 1800s by a British naval captain, Captain Casement, as the British were colonizing the islands. And then it said something even more important. The justification that he gave for this violent act was that the canoe was being used for head hunting associated with cannibalism. However, the museum also admits that there was no evidence to support such a claim. It was just a pretext. It was merely a pretext for taking what was not his. That's where truth begins, not just in what we display in the big fancy buildings, but in what we are willing to admit. Another artifact is an Ethiopian satchel containing sacred writings, possibly a Bible written in Ge'ez or Amharic. Ge'ez is an ancient Semitic language of the Horn of Africa and the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. A Bible written in Ge'ez or Amharic is not just a text. It represents one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, dating back to the early centuries of the faith. These manuscripts reflect indigenous African Christianity developed independently of European control and a deep continuity of worship preserved through language across centuries. It is evidence that the Word of God has been preserved, studied, and lived out in Africa for centuries, long before many Christian narratives ever acknowledged it. What happens when sacred things are removed from their people? You don't just lose an object, you lose context. You lose your place in the redemption story. You lose voice. You lose identity as a chosen people transmitted through generations. And you lose meaning. One of the most powerful pieces wasn't ancient at all, it wasn't old. A textile from Colombia created by indigenous women who survived violence and internal displacement themselves. They used art to tell their story. The word Cimarrón on this piece refers to a runaway slave, someone who refused to remain in bondage. And through this work, they said something profound. We can remember without pain. That's important because decolonization is not only about exposing the harm that was done to us, it's about reclaiming the ability to retell your story on your terms. Then I saw a mask, a carved face representing a white male. It was painted white, a counter story to blackface. There's a cross on the forehead, as you can see, and it likely represented a missionary. It had sharp teeth designed to tear flesh and destroy prey, symbolizing an angry and destructive spirit. But what's striking is this. This is the reverse of what we're used to. Instead of Europeans interpreting indigenous people, portraying them as Europeans saw them, this is indigenous people interpreting Europeans. And the image is not flattering. It suggests anger, hostility, perhaps even fear. But it also suggests resistance on the part of those who were victimized and exploited. So when you step back, a pattern emerges: creation, extraction, distortion, but now correction. These objects traveled thousands of miles, but the truth about them is now just arriving. So ultimately, what I saw in that museum was far more than a collection. It was a shift from silence to testimony, from possession to accountability, and from distortion to truth. And if that truth can be told about these objects, then it can be told about a people, the people who created them, about the cultures from which they were taken, about histories that have been buried. Because restoration always begins the same way. Someone begins to tell the truth. Thank you for joining me on this week's Freedom Friday. I hope other museums will emulate the example of the Ulster Museum. Taking accountability in this way is a positive step towards redressing the historic injustices meted out to the world's indigenous populations, and it helps to restore and rebuild that which was taken. If you found this to be helpful, if you found this week's episode to be helpful, hit the subscribe button below this episode and share it with others. This is Freedom Friday, where we tell the whole story.